Okay. Testing, testing. Okay, we're on now. Thank you. I thought since we're going to be celebrating Thanksgiving, I should talk about the Pilgrims and American Protestantism as we continue our discussions on the Protestant Reformation. And next week will be my last sermon on this. Thanksgiving is my favorite American holiday, and I don't know if you know, but it actually became a holiday well over 200 years after the Pilgrims landed in Massachusetts during the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. It actually became an official holiday, which we celebrate to this day in late November. I'd like to talk about the Pilgrims, a very special group of people in American history, godly people, God's people. And just like the Bible, in the record of history, doesn't omit the reality of the failures and mistakes and major blind spots of God's people. So we should look at the history of American Protestantism and the Pilgrims and even the whole Thanksgiving story in the light of reality and not just in a romantic, unrealistic way. So we're going to look at the reality of the Pilgrims. The fact that they were God's people doesn't mean that they were not without fault and that they did not make mistakes in their way of thinking that we could learn from. Just like Martin Luther, right? God used him, man of God, did great things, but he was definitely coming out of a period of darkness, and how much could we expect from Martin Luther? The movement that he began, even though he was far from understanding the importance of the separation of church and state, but the movement that Martin Luther began opened the doors. It laid a foundation for what later would develop into a society where church and state are separate. Just like Thomas Jefferson, he wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, but he owns slaves." But he began a thinking pattern that eventually would cause a harvest of freedom for the slaves. So we look at history, we look at godly people, important people, good people in history that have made important contributions, but we also have to understand where they failed and where their blind spots were so we can learn and benefit from them. So we don't just want to look at the romantic side of history, we want to look at the real side of history. So let's talk about the Pilgrims today. The Pilgrims, a Christian group of people from England, they were nonconformists. They were not willing to conform to the established church in England. The Church of England was very much like the Roman Catholic Church. Very few changes other than the name and some details, but the form was still the same. And they were sincere Christians that felt like things were not right with the established church, so they were known as nonconformists. And back then, there was no concept of a separation of church and state. So they were on the fringes of society, marginalized. They went to Holland, but Holland was the opposite extreme. There was so much worldliness, so much promiscuity, too much freedom, and they were afraid their children would become worldly, so they decided to go to the New World in the early part of the 17th century. Aboard the Mayflower, in search of religious freedom. They landed in Massachusetts in the year 1620. They were looking for religious freedom for themselves in order for them to practice Christianity according to the dictates of their conscience. The mentality of the Pilgrims was, we are spiritual Israel, because Paul does make that clear in the New Testament, that if you are of Christ, you are Abraham's children, and therefore you're spiritual Israel. And so they were coming to the promised land. That's what the North American continent represented for them, the promised land. And like the children of Israel of old, what were they commissioned by God to do in the Promised Land once they had settled under Moses and Joshua's leadership. They were supposed to create a society, right? A theocracy where God would reign, His law would be supreme. And would there be any room for paganism and any room for false religion in the new continent? Not in the Puritans' mind. They were there to establish a Christian society different from England in that they were going to follow the Bible, at least their interpretation of the Bible. So in 1620, the Puritan fathers of the Massachusetts Bay Colony did not tolerate opposing religious views. Attendance in church on Sundays was mandatory. There were fines if those laws were broken. They viewed their new home as a city upon a hill, a theocracy that harbored no religious or political dissent. Very quickly, they were practicing the same forms of intolerance in New England that they experienced in England under the Church of England, the Anglican Church. The history of the American colonies prior to the United States Constitution. So you have a period of about 150 years of history where you have Protestant America, right? Well, how far from God's ideal were they? Before the U.S. Constitution, battles between various Protestant sects and between Protestants and Catholics took place in those early colonies prior to the Revolutionary War and the founding of a new nation with the American Constitution, which today we value so much. This is a makeup, a religious makeup of the colonies during the 18th century. You have the dominant religions, Anglican, which was really the Church of England, because those that settled in Jamestown in Virginia, they were faithful to the established church. And they were coming to the New World not for religious freedom, but for economic interests. Whereas in the North, in Massachusetts, those that came to the New World were coming for freedom in order for them to practice their Christianity according to their conscience. But a dominant religious group in the early colonies were the Anglicans, those who were faithful to the Church of England. And then, of course, you have the Congregational group, which was the Puritans, the nonconformists. You had Lutherans, a very small but influential pocket of Christians that were faithful to Luther, Lutherans. You had the Presbyterians, who were the ones that followed in the tradition of Calvin. And then you had the smaller, more marginalized groups like the Baptists and the Roman Catholics and the Jews. And of course you had the Quakers and other groups. And I mean, it was far from a very peaceful and Christian society, because you had different forms of Christianity competing for the supremacy. Anti-Catholic feelings contributed to laws that discriminated against Catholics in matters of property and voting. It's almost like the tables had turned somewhat. Even after Americans gained independence from Britain, some states had very questionable religious laws. One of the most famous dissidents in Massachusetts was a man named Roger Williams. He was part of the Puritan community, but he was banished because of disagreements over theology and public policy. He founded Providence, Rhode Island. From Puritan Boston's earliest days, Catholics were banned from the colonies along with other non-Puritans. Further south, you had Quakers who were being persecuted. 4 Quakers were hanged in Boston between 1659 and 1661 for their beliefs. So up north, Quakers were not tolerated. Quakers were seen as dissidents. And you had martyrs, Quaker martyrs. Here you have on the screen a statue of Mary Dyer, who was a Quaker who died. He was hanged. She was hanged in Boston in 1660. This was all happening in the New World. Let me give you an example of some of the religious laws that existed in the early colonies before the nation was formed. In Massachusetts, only Christians were allowed to hold public office, and Catholics were allowed to do so only after renouncing papal authority. In 1777, New York State's Constitution banned Catholics from public office and would do so until 1806. By the way, some to this day might even say this is a good thing. I mean, we want to keep those Catholics out of public office, right? Well, that mentality, because you may disagree with Catholic theology or even know the history of what Catholicism stands for even to this day, and prophecy and the history of Middle Ages, but that mentality is only a new form of the old Catholicism that we claim to oppose. So I'm not sure if that's the way Christians should think. Disagreeing with theology doesn't mean that you establish religious tests for public office. In Maryland, Catholics had full civil rights, but Jews did not. So the Jews were another group that were marginalized. Delaware required an oath affirming belief in the Trinity. So if you don't believe in the Trinity, as many faithful Christians in the early colonies were that way, they were anti-Trinitarian, including many of our pioneers, the pioneers of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, like James White and Uriah Smith and Joseph Bates. They were congregational, and they were anti-Trinitarian. Well, in Delaware, if you were anti-Trinitarian, you were in trouble, because for public office, an oath was required affirming belief in the Trinity. Several states, including Massachusetts and South Carolina, had official state-supported churches. And this is what Ellen White has to say in the book Great Controversy, in the book on page 292. It was the desire for liberty of conscience that inspired the Pilgrims to brave the perils of the long journey across the sea, to endure the hardships and dangers of the wilderness, and with God's blessing to lay on the shores of America the foundation of a mighty nation. That's the bright spot. Yet, honest and God-fearing as they were, the Pilgrims did not yet comprehend the great principle of religious liberty. The freedom which they sacrificed so much to secure for themselves, they were not equally ready to grant to others. A part of our history we don't want to forget, because we learn from history when we face the reality of the mistakes that people have made. Good people, godly people, people God used to do a great work. So let's talk about some of the heroes who also had their major blind spots, but they were champions of a new concept that was foreign to Martin Luther, foreign to many of the Pilgrims. That's the idea of the separation of church and state. That's what I'd like to talk about next week in our closing study on the Reformation. The idea of the separation of church and state, I have a burden to share because I find that it is a topic very misunderstood even by us as Seventh-day Adventists. Sometimes I hear Seventh-day Adventists talking about social issues and political issues, and I get the impression that we don't understand ourselves the importance of keeping a separation between church and state. We should never hope for laws that will be established to clean up society based on our religious convictions, understanding what the Bible teaches about certain subjects. The church's role in making an impact and cleaning up society is through the pulpit, not through legislation. But sometimes Christians want to see laws passed that will put a check in practices in society that the Bible may condemn. We want to see practices in society change because the Bible teaches contrary to them. The church must do its work from the pulpit. Thomas Jefferson was a man that was building on the foundations of Martin Luther and the Pilgrims and many other Protestants, but he took things a step far beyond them. In 1779, Jefferson was serving as governor of Virginia, and he drafted a bill that guaranteed legal equality for citizens of all religions, including those of no religion. Now, this was very new and unique. You can be an atheist and still be a lawful and good, abiding citizen of society. Thomas Jefferson wrote this, and we have to appreciate what he wrote in the context of the day he lived. But it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. What he is implying is that civil authorities should only intervene if my neighbor is causing me bodily harm. If he is threatening my security, my safety, my well-being, my liberty, then yes, call the police, call on the authorities. We do want laws. We want laws to keep society intact and civil, but not necessarily to impose the teachings of the Bible, except for where the teachings of the Bible overlap with civil issues, like thou shalt not kill. The Bible teaches thou shalt not kill, and we most definitely want civil laws that echo that commandment. So there is an overlap. But where we can get into trouble is when we decide that the state should outlaw worship of idols or prayer to Mary. You may not pray to Mary because you understand that the Bible does not condone that. It doesn't require that. It condemns that kind of thing. But for you to expect laws that will forbid your neighbor to pray to Mary opens the door for all kinds of trouble for all religious groups. In 1786, the Virginia Act for establishing religious freedom became law. So Virginia actually was a pioneer state under Thomas Jefferson and James Madison for establishing this idea that you can have a civil society. As a matter of fact, in order to have a civil and peaceful society, you must have a separation between church and state. Doesn't mean Christians can't hold office. It doesn't mean Christians cannot hold office. But it does mean Christians should not use public office in order to promote their Christianity. And, you know, this is a very difficult discussion. We'll talk about it more next week. But, you know, at the end of the day, when the church lacks the Holy Spirit and it lacks spirituality and it sees that it is powerless in society to do the work God has given it to do, it becomes desperate and it decides that it needs help. And instead of going to God through prayer for the Holy Spirit to do its work, to pour out His power on the church, it goes to the civil powers in order to check the evils in society that it sees it is unable to do because it lacks the power. That's really at the core of a church wanting the state to enact religious laws. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "The law meant to comprehend within the mantle of its protection the Jew, the Gentile, the Christian, and the Mohammedan, the Hindu, and infidel of every denomination. A society where all of these groups can live together peacefully. Well, we know that that's very idealistic. We live in a society today where theoretically this is true, but we don't see the peace that it promised because the problem is with human nature. James Madison, who later became President of the United States, he was very important in the writing of the Constitution. In his essay titled Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments, he eloquently laid out the reasons why the state had no business supporting Christian theology. That was his thesis. The state should not promote Christian theology. The religion, then, of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man to exercise it as these may dictate. This right is, in its nature, an inalienable right. Madison believed that a government sanction of a religion was, in essence, a threat to all religion. That's what the history of the Dark Ages and the history of Protestantism, both in Europe and early America, teaches us. Who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion of all other religions may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians in exclusion of all other sects? As a Christian, Madison understood that Christianity spread most powerfully and impacted society most significantly in the face of persecution from secular government, not with their help. History should teach us that. Christianity disavows a dependence on the powers of this world. For it is known that this religion both existed and flourished not only without the support of human laws, but in spite of every opposition from them. Go back and read the New Testament. This is James Madison in 1835. And I have no doubt that every new example will succeed as every past one has done in showing that religion and government will both exist in greater purity the less they are mixed together. A lot of wisdom. One last prominent figure in early America, George Washington, first president of the United States. In 1790, he wrote, "All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunity of citizenship. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens." So in other words, if your neighbor prays to Mary and you don't agree with that, but your neighbor doesn't steal, doesn't kill, doesn't threaten your freedoms, then you should be able to live and abide peacefully with them. See, that was foreign to the thinking of people in the 18th century. This was revolutionary, and a new kind of nation was born from this mentality. In Romans chapter 14, verse 5, even though the circumstances were different, but I believe Paul understood exactly what Thomas Jefferson was advocating for. Now, this is in the context of the church, not of society. But Paul writes, in the context of the church, Romans 14:5, one person esteems one day above another. Another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced or persuaded in his own mind. Paul was not talking about the day of worship, although in the context of society, this may very well apply to the day of worship. But in the context of the Christian church in the first century, this was referring to how Jewish should we be as Christians. And there were some in the Christian church that believed that we should be very Jewish. So we should observe certain days and have certain restrictions in our diet related to the ceremonies and the festivals. And other groups said, well, we're beyond that, and Paul was probably one of them, much more progressive. For him, eating foods offered to idols wasn't an issue, and he didn't see the merit in practicing certain Jewish festivals and observing certain Jewish holidays. But Paul's whole thinking was, we can live peacefully, even as a church community, with certain differences. Not all differences. In 1 Corinthians 5, to the young man sleeping with his father's wife, he said, this difference we cannot live with in the church. So we turn him over to society. Turn him over to Satan is the language that Paul used. So Paul understood that in the church, we can live peaceably with some differences. That's what Romans 14:5 teaches us. He also understood that some differences in the church are non-negotiable. And if we happen to have them, then we have to disfellowship the one that is not willing to accept those fundamental teachings of the church. But Paul didn't say, turn them over to the Roman authorities so that they could be burned at the stake or killed in the Colosseums. In other words, if there are differences within the church, in other words, there are people that don't feel like this church family, because of what it believes or stands for, is for them, they have every freedom to go, but not to be tried or killed for those differences. And that was the problem in England when the Pilgrims were basically forced to leave. They were still Christians, but they did not believe like the established church. But in England, in the late 16th, early 17th century, if you were not willing to conform to the Church of England, you not only became excommunicated, you could lose your life. You could go to jail. The author of the book Pilgrim's Progress. How many of you have heard of that book? Pilgrim's Progress. John Bunyan. He was a nonconformist. He went to jail. He went to prison. He wrote the book Pilgrim's Progress while he was in prison because he refused to preach with a license from the Church of England. So it gives you an idea of where society went. Now it's interesting, this is Paul converted, because the unconverted Paul was killing Christians, putting them in jail, taking them out of their homes. He was terrorizing because people were not willing to conform. He was using every weapon, every resource, every tool in his reach to cause others to conform to his points of view. And years later, as a converted man, this is the Spirit of Christ here. Some differences we can tolerate. Do you know what differences we can tolerate and what we can't tolerate? You know, there's confusion about that. I've seen a lot of things that have been filed in the category of non-tolerable differences that go totally contrary to Paul's spirit in Romans 14. There are some differences that we should tolerate in our church. And then in society, there are some differences that we should tolerate. If my neighbor worships Muhammad, worships Allah, believes in Muhammad, I can tolerate that in a society. Because the alternative to that is one religion which everyone conforms to. And it can be the Christian religion, but then it's going to be a form of Christianity that I may not be willing to conform to. And so we don't blame people like Martin Luther and Zwingli and Calvin and even the Pilgrims, for the way they thought, because we have to understand where they were and where they were coming out of. See, we don't blame Thomas Jefferson for owning slaves. We thank God that they did what they did because it set in motion a course of events that laid a foundation for future improvements in society, future progress. The question is, where are we? What is our spirit? This is what Jesus said, and we'll close with this. Luke 9, Jesus had this problem with his disciples. Luke chapter 9, verse 46, the Bible says, "Then a dispute arose among them, the disciples, as to which of them would be greatest. And Jesus, perceiving the thought of their heart, took a little child and set him by him." Jump over to verse 49. "Now John answered and said, 'Master, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we forbade him because he does not follow with us.'" That's the spirit we don't want to be of. And we have to understand how that would apply today. They go to Jesus and they say, "Lord, we forbade him because how dare they think that you could use them to do a work in your name, given that they're not part of our group?" Jesus said, "No, you have the wrong spirit. Do not forbid him." And then verse 51, "It came to pass when the time had come for him to be received up, that he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem and sent messengers before his face. And as they went, they entered a village of the Samaritans to prepare for him, but they did not receive him." The Samaritans did not receive Jesus because his face was set for the journey to Jerusalem. "And when his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, 'Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, just as Elijah did?'" It's in the Bible, right? God used fire to consume the enemies. So why not use fire to consume the Samaritans? This is what Jesus said. This is the key point. Verse 55. "But he turned and rebuked them and said, 'You do not know what manner of spirit you are of. For the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them.'" You know, the act of a church disfellowshipping someone is for their salvation. That's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5. Turn them over to Satan for the salvation of the Spirit. John's attitude in wanting fire to come down from heaven to consume them was to destroy them, not to save them. Their pride was wounded because of their attitude. So, that's the question for us. What spirit are